I survived war zones most people can't pronounce. I walked through streets where every shadow could be your last breath, where trust was a luxury you couldn't afford, and silence was the only language that kept you alive. For 13 years, I operated in places that don't exist on maps, doing things that will never make it into history books. I learned to read danger in the tilt of a stranger's head, in the weight of footsteps 3 blocks away, in the pattern of lights going dark in apartment windows. I proved myself in rooms full of men who didn't think I belonged there, earned my place through sheer competence when charm and politics wouldn't have been enough. But the most dangerous place I ever walked into wasn't in some forgotten corner of the Middle East or a jungle compound in South America. It was my own home, the house I bought with blood money, the mansion I purchased to keep one person safe, to give her the life she deserved after decades of sacrifice. My mother didn't recognize me that night. She was serving drinks, carrying trays of champagne through crowds of strangers. In the house I bought to protect her. Her hands trembled as she offered glasses to people who looked through her like she was furniture, like she was part of the decor in a $7.8 million estate that had her name on the deed. I stood there in the marble foyer, still wearing my tactical boots, dust from another continent still on my jacket, and watched my mother move like a ghost through a party that shouldn't have been happening. She walked past me 3 times before her eyes finally caught mine, and even then, there was only confusion. Not recognition. Not relief. Just the tired, empty look of someone who had forgotten they were supposed to be free. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The questions started forming before I could even process what I was seeing. Who allowed this to happen? Who told my mother, a woman who raised me alone, who worked 3 jobs to keep me fed, that she needed to serve drinks in her own house? Why was she dressed like staff, wearing a plain black uniform that looked like it came from a catering company? Where did the money go? The funds I had transferred every month without fail for over a decade, the accounts I set up specifically to ensure she never had to work again. And why did everyone lie? Because as I looked around that crowded living room, at the faces turning toward me with surprise and something else, something that looked like guilt mixed with annoyance, I realized they all knew. Every single person in that house knew what was happening, and not one of them thought to tell me. What I discovered next made me realize this wasn't neglect. It wasn't a misunderstanding or a series of unfortunate events. This was exploitation, calculated and deliberate, carried out by the people I trusted most in the world. Let me take you back, because understanding what happened that night requires knowing where we came from. My mother was 18 when she had me, barely more than a kid herself, and my father disappeared before my first birthday. I have vague memories of shouting, of doors slamming, of my mother crying in the bathroom with the water running so I wouldn't hear. Then he was gone, and it was just the 2 of us against the world. We lived in a cramped apartment in Richmond, Virginia, the kind of place where the walls were so thin you could hear your neighbors breathing, where the heat only worked half the winter, and where the lock on the front door was held together with duct tape and hope. My mother worked as a nurse's aide during the day, cleaned office buildings at night, and somehow still found time on weekends to do alterations and sewing for people in the neighborhood. I remember falling asleep to the sound of her sewing machine, that rhythmic mechanical hum that meant she was still working while I dreamed. She never complained, never made me feel like I was a burden, even though I know now how exhausting it must have been. She taught me about dignity, about the value of honest work, about keeping your word even when it cost you. She taught me that family was everything, that blood meant loyalty, and that you protected the people you loved no matter what. She also taught me to be strong, to never let anyone make me feel small, to fight for what I believed in even when the world said I didn't belong. Those lessons shaped everything I became, every decision I made, including the one that took me away from her. I was 17 when I walked into the recruiting office, a skinny girl with something to prove, and nowhere else to channel the anger I felt about our circumstances. The recruiter looked at me like I was lost, asked if I was sure, told me about all the other opportunities available for young women. I told him I wanted combat roles, intelligence work, something that mattered. He laughed, but he processed my paperwork. I was 18 when I signed the papers that would change everything. My mother didn't want me to go. She stood in our tiny kitchen, the same kitchen where she had made breakfast before school for years, and she cried. Not loud, dramatic tears, but quiet ones that rolled down her cheeks while she kept her hands busy washing dishes that were already clean. I told her I was doing this for us, that the military would give me opportunities we could never afford otherwise, that I would send money home, and one day I would buy her a real house, a place where the heat always worked and the neighbors were far enough away that she could have peace. She made me promise to stay safe, to write when I could, to remember that I had nothing to prove to anyone except myself. She told me that being a woman in that world would be harder, that I would face things she couldn't protect me from, but that she believed in me. I promised to stay safe. I promised to come home. I meant it. But promises made in kitchen lighting don't always survive the darkness of the real world. The military took me, trained me, broke me down, and built me back into something harder. I was good at it, better than most of the men who resented my presence, and that's both what saved me and what made everything more difficult. I learned quickly that competence wasn't always enough, that I had to be twice as good to be considered half as capable, that every mistake would be attributed to my gender, while every success would be dismissed as luck or someone else's work. I didn't let it stop me. I couldn't afford to. I pushed harder, trained longer, volunteered for assignments others wouldn't touch. Within 3 years, I was recruited into special operations, intelligence gathering, and direct action missions that required a specific kind of person, someone who could make impossible decisions in impossible situations and still function the next day. Being a woman became an asset in certain contexts. I could move through spaces my male counterparts couldn't, could gather information from sources who would never talk to a man, could blend into environments where a military presence would stand out. For 13 years, I moved through the shadows of the world, and for 13 years, I sent money home. Every month, without fail, a substantial portion of my pay went directly into accounts I had set up for my mother. I called when I could, wrote when I couldn't, and dreamed about the day I could finally come home and see her living the life she deserved. 7 years into my service, I bought the mansion. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. $7.8 million is a staggering amount of money, even for someone in my position, even with the bonuses and hazard pay and all the other compensation that comes with doing the kind of work that most people don't survive. But I had been saving obsessively, investing carefully with advice from financial advisors who worked with military personnel, and I had reached a point where I could afford to give my mother something extraordinary. The house was in Newport Beach, California, overlooking the ocean, surrounded by security and privacy, with enough space that she would never feel cramped again. It had 6 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a chef's kitchen that would make her smile, and windows that looked out over water so blue it didn't seem real. I bought it in her name, transferred the deed completely, made sure all the paperwork was ironclad. This was her house, her sanctuary, her reward for all those years of sacrifice. Nothing would ever change that. Or so I thought. I arranged for my younger sister to help her with the move, to handle the logistics while I was deployed in a location I still can't name. She was 4 years younger than me, had always been the charming one, the social butterfly who could talk her way into or out of anything. She worked in event planning and hospitality management, or at least that's what she called it, moving from project to project with promises of big opportunities that never quite materialized the way she described them. But she was family, she was my sister, and I trusted her. That was my first mistake. I thought buying the house was the hardest part, making the financial commitment, arranging the purchase from halfway around the world, coordinating everything while operating in conditions where a phone call could compromise an entire mission. I was wrong. The hardest part was coming home. The day I returned, I didn't tell anyone I was coming. Operational security habits die hard, and part of me wanted to surprise my mother, to see her face when I walked through the door unannounced. I took a military transport to Dover Air Force Base, then a commercial flight to LAX, then rented a car and drove down the coast to Newport Beach. It was late afternoon when I pulled up to the gates, the California sun turning everything golden, the ocean breeze carrying the smell of salt and expensive real estate. The gates were open. That was the first sign something was wrong. I had installed a sophisticated security system, biometric access, and encrypted codes, designed to keep my mother safe from exactly the kind of people who might see a woman living alone in a multi-million-dollar house as a target. But the gate stood wide open, and as I drove up the long driveway, I saw cars parked everywhere. Luxury vehicles. Range Rovers and Porsches and Teslas lined up like it was a charity gala. Music was playing, loud enough that I could hear it before I even turned off my engine. Some kind of upbeat pop music that seemed completely wrong for a house that was supposed to be a peaceful retirement for a woman in her 60s. I sat in my rental car for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to reconcile the scene in front of me with the image I had carried in my head for months. Then I got out and walked toward the house. The front door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped into chaos that had been organized into something that looked deliberate. There were people everywhere, dozens of them, maybe 60 or more, drinking and laughing and networking in my mother's house. The furniture I had carefully selected, pieces chosen for comfort and meaning, had been rearranged or removed entirely to create more mingling space. The art I had commissioned, works that told stories about resilience and family and home, had been taken down or covered with promotional banners for brands I didn't recognize. The house looked like a corporate event space, and not one person noticed me walk in. I moved through the crowd like I had been trained to do, observing everything, categorizing faces, assessing the situation with the detached efficiency that keeps you alive in hostile territory. That's when I saw her. My mother was carrying a tray of champagne flutes, moving carefully through the crowd, her eyes down, her shoulders curved inward like she was trying to make herself invisible. She was wearing a simple black dress and a white apron, the universal uniform of service staff at upscale events. Her hair, which she had always worn natural and free, was pulled back into a severe bun that made her face look smaller, older, more tired. She looked diminished, and that's the word that kept echoing in my mind as I watched her navigate through people who took glasses from her tray without acknowledgement, without even making eye contact. She moved past me, close enough that I could have reached out and touched her, and she didn't even look up. I watched her make a circuit of the room, watched her refill the tray from a service table in the corner, watched her return to the crowd like this was normal, like this was what she was supposed to be doing. Then she turned, starting another lap, and our eyes finally met. For a moment, there was nothing. No recognition, no spark of awareness, just the polite emptiness of a service worker acknowledging a guest. Then something shifted, confusion flickering across her face, and she stopped walking. The tray in her hands began to shake. Glasses clinked together, champagne sloshing dangerously close to the rims. I stepped forward, taking the tray from her hands before she could drop it, and said her name. Just her name, nothing more, because suddenly I couldn't find any other words. She stared at me, and I watched reality slowly reassemble itself behind her eyes. Recognition came in waves. First surprise, then disbelief, then something that looked like shame, and finally, tears. She reached for me, her hands finding my arms, my shoulders, my face, like she needed to physically confirm I was real, like she thought I might disappear if she didn't hold on. Around us, the party continued, but we stood in our own bubble of silence, two people finding each other in the middle of chaos. Then someone called her name, sharp and impatient, demanding another round of drinks, and the bubble burst. My mother's expression changed, fear replacing everything else, and she tried to pull away. I held on. I looked past her, following the voice to its source, and saw my sister standing near the kitchen, watching us with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between annoyance and calculation. And that's when I realized everyone here knew. They knew this was my house, my mother, my family. They knew what was happening was wrong. And they had all decided it was acceptable. If this part is making sense, comment I'm still here. I want to know who's really watching. What followed was a confrontation that started in the foyer and moved through the house like a storm, conducted in tense whispers and barely contained fury, while the party continued around us. My sister tried to explain, to justify, to make what I was seeing sound reasonable and even beneficial. She told me my mother had volunteered to help with events, that she enjoyed feeling useful and connected, that the parties were networking opportunities and fundraisers that would benefit everyone involved. She said the house was too large for one person to maintain properly, that it made sense to leverage the space for events, that I was being dramatic and misreading a perfectly normal situation. When I asked why our mother was dressed like hired help, my sister said it was more professional that way, that it prevented confusion among the guests and maintained appropriate boundaries. When I asked who had authorized these parties, she said she had been given power of attorney to manage the property, that I had granted her authority to handle things while I was deployed and unreachable. When I asked where the money was going, the monthly deposits I had been making religiously for years, she said it was all being managed properly, reinvested into property maintenance and event coordination, that there was nothing to worry about, and everything was documented. Every answer was smooth, practiced, delivered with the easy confidence of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in her head many times, someone who had prepared for the possibility of being questioned. But I had spent 13 years learning to read people under pressure, to hear what wasn't being said, to spot deception in the smallest microexpressions and tonal shifts. My sister was lying. Not about everything, but about enough. And the people around us, the ones who had stopped pretending not to listen, they were all complicit in their silence. I shut the party down, told everyone to leave, my voice carrying the command authority I had learned in rooms where hesitation could cost lives. I ignored the protests and the indignation and the claims that they had been personally invited, that they had every right to be there, that I was creating an uncomfortable scene. I stood at the door and watched them file out, watched my sister leave with them, her face tight with barely suppressed anger and something else, something that looked like fear that her carefully constructed arrangement was falling apart. Then I closed the door, locked it with the override code only I knew, and turned to find my mother sitting on the stairs, still wearing that awful uniform, crying into her hands with the kind of deep, shaking sobs that come from somewhere beyond immediate pain, from accumulated grief and exhaustion and shame. We talked through the night. At first, she tried to defend my sister, to make excuses, to tell me I was misunderstanding the situation and being too harsh. But slowly, carefully, I started asking questions, specific questions that required concrete answers, the kind of questions I had learned to ask when gathering intelligence from reluctant sources. When had this started? How often did these parties happen? Who decided she would work them instead of hosting them? Where was the money I had been sending? Had she signed any documents recently? With each question, the facade cracked a little more, and the truth began to emerge like something ugly being pulled into the light. My sister had moved into the house shortly after my mother arrived, claiming she needed a place to stay while launching a new business venture. That temporary arrangement had become permanent. She had started hosting small gatherings, networking events she called them, using the house and the ocean view and the prestige of the address to impress potential clients and investors. The small gatherings had become elaborate parties, the networking events had become regular occurrences, and somewhere along the way, my mother had transitioned from hostess to staff. My sister had told her it was necessary, that the guests expected a certain level of professional service, that it would be awkward and uncomfortable if they knew the woman serving drinks was actually the homeowner. She had told our mother that the parties were generating income that would help offset the substantial costs of maintaining such a large property, that the overhead was significant, and this was a smart way to make the house pay for itself. She had told our mother that I knew about all of it, that I had approved, that I had specifically asked her to handle things this way because I was too busy with military operations to manage property details myself. My mother, trusting her daughter and wanting to be helpful, had believed her. Over the next week, I began investigating in earnest, applying the same analytical skills I used in intelligence gathering to unravel what had happened to my family. I started with the financial accounts, the ones I had set up with specific instructions and multiple layers of protection. What I found made my blood run cold. The accounts had been systematically drained, thousands of dollars redirected every month to accounts I didn't recognize, to business entities that existed only on paper, to credit cards and investment schemes that benefited my sister's lifestyle and ambitions. My sister had indeed obtained power of attorney, using documents that appeared to have my mother's signature, though I suspected our mother had signed them without fully understanding what they authorized or how they could be used. She had used that authority to hire event staff, to pay for party supplies and marketing materials, to cover costs that should never have existed, all while paying herself a substantial management fee for coordinating everything. The monthly deposits I had been making, money intended to ensure my mother never had to worry about anything again, had been treated as operational funding for my sister's event planning business and personal expenses. I found invoices for catering companies that charged premium rates, for sound and lighting systems, for promotional photographers and social media consultants. I found contracts with vendors and service providers, all structured to funnel money through my sister's accounts. I found a detailed business plan that outlined transforming the mansion into a high-end event venue, with my mother listed not as owner but as property manager and service coordinator, her compensation set barely above minimum wage for what was framed as part-time work. The more I investigated, the angrier I became, but I kept my emotions locked down, channeled into cold, methodical analysis the way I had been trained. I interviewed the neighbors, who confirmed the parties had been happening multiple times a month for over a year, that the noise and traffic had been a source of growing frustration, that some of them had tried to reach out to my mother but had been told by my sister that everything was authorized and legal. I spoke with the bank, who provided records showing the pattern of withdrawals and transfers, the steady drain of funds that should have been accumulating for my mother's security. I tracked down several people who had attended that first party I witnessed, and some of them, once they understood who I was and what had really been happening, admitted they had thought it was strange that an older woman was working the events, that the situation had felt uncomfortable, but they had assumed it was a legitimate employment arrangement. I found the catering staff my sister had hired, people who were supposed to be supporting events, but who had been told to defer to my sister for all decisions, to treat my mother as just another worker rather than the homeowner. When I confronted them, they tried to distance themselves, claiming they were following instructions, that they had assumed everything was legitimate, that they had no way of knowing the real situation. Some of them offered weak excuses about my mother seeming confused sometimes, suggesting she needed supervision and structure, that the work arrangement was actually therapeutic for her. One of them even tried to tell me that my mother had expressed gratitude for feeling useful, that I was taking away something that gave her purpose by interfering with the established routine. Then I found the document that changed everything, the piece of evidence that made it impossible to deny what had really happened or to accept any of the justifications. It was a revised property deed, transferring partial ownership from my mother to my sister, dated 8 months after my mother had moved into the house. The signature was supposedly hers, witnessed and notarized, looking official and legitimate. But I knew my mother's handwriting intimately, had saved every letter and card she had ever sent me over 13 years of deployment, had memorized the way she formed certain letters, the pressure she applied, the small inconsistencies that made her signature uniquely hers. This wasn't quite right. The overall shape was close, but the flow was too smooth, too consistent, lacking the slight tremor that had developed in her hands over the years, the small hesitation before certain letters that came from old muscle memory. My mother had no memory of signing this document. When I showed it to her, she stared at it with confusion and growing distress, insisting she would never have agreed to give away part of the house, that she barely understood legal paperwork beyond basic bills and contracts, that she always relied on my sister to explain anything complicated. I believed her. More importantly, I knew how to prove it, because the military had taught me that verification matters more than trust, especially when something feels wrong. I hired a forensic document examiner, a former federal investigator who specialized in detecting forged signatures and fraudulent legal documents. It took her less than 2 days to confirm what I already suspected. The signature was forged, created using a sophisticated tracing technique that copied a genuine signature from another document, but lacked the natural variation and pressure dynamics of authentic handwriting. The forgery was good enough to pass casual inspection, probably good enough to satisfy a notary who wasn't paying close attention, but under proper forensic analysis with specialized equipment, it was obvious. My sister hadn't just exploited my mother financially and emotionally. She had committed fraud, had forged legal documents to steal property that didn't belong to her, had built an entire scheme on top of that foundational crime. Armed with this evidence, I confronted her again, this time with attorneys present, in a meeting I structured and controlled. I expected denial, anger, maybe even threats or attempts at manipulation. What I got was something I hadn't fully anticipated, a calculated coldness that revealed just how far she had drifted from the sister I thought I knew. My sister didn't deny the forgery outright, but she also didn't admit it in any way that could be used against her legally. Instead, she pivoted, arguing that the house was too much responsibility for one person, that I had been naive and irresponsible to think my mother could manage it alone, that she had been protecting the asset and ensuring it was used productively instead of sitting empty most of the time. She claimed the parties were legitimate business ventures that generated real income, that the event planning business she was building had genuine value, that she had been planning to share profits once everything was properly established and scaled. She suggested that I was the one being unreasonable, that I had abandoned my mother for 13 years and had no right to suddenly appear and disrupt the life and routines they had built together. She even tried to manipulate my mother directly, reminding her of all the times she had been there when I wasn't, all the ordinary days and small moments I had missed while I was deployed, all the practical support she had provided while I was off doing what she called playing soldier. Some of what she said cut deep because it wasn't entirely wrong, and that made it more painful and more effective. I had been gone. I had missed birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments that might have seemed small but actually mattered. I had sent money instead of presents, financial support instead of time and attention. But I had done it because I believed the sacrifice meant something, because I trusted my sister to protect what I couldn't be there to protect myself. That trust had been a fundamental mistake. The legal process was complicated and frustrating, a maze of jurisdictions and procedures and technicalities that seemed designed to exhaust your will to fight. My attorneys filed complaints, pursued charges for fraud and elder financial exploitation, worked to reverse the fraudulent property transfer and recover stolen funds. My sister hired expensive lawyers, the kind who specialize in creating legal complexity and finding procedural escape routes. They argued that the signature analysis was inconclusive and subject to interpretation, that my mother had signed numerous documents over the years and couldn't reasonably be expected to remember each one specifically, that the power of attorney granted my sister legitimate authority to make property decisions on my mother's behalf in my absence. They painted me as an absentee daughter who had only recently taken interest in her mother's welfare, who was now trying to control her mother's life and assets out of misplaced guilt and military-style need for control. They filed counterclaims, alleging I was causing emotional distress and financial harm by disrupting established living arrangements and business operations. The case dragged on for months, and with each delay, each motion, each procedural complication, I felt the system grinding away at any hope of real justice. My mother, caught in the middle of this conflict between her daughters, deteriorated visibly. The stress of the legal battle, the betrayal by one daughter, the guilt over not recognizing what was happening sooner, it all took a severe toll. She stopped sleeping properly, her appetite disappeared, she began withdrawing into herself in ways that frightened me. I hired professional caregivers, vetted carefully this time, people whose only job was to support her health and well-being without any other agenda, but I could see the damage had already been done. The woman who had been so strong, who had raised 2 daughters alone and never complained about the difficulty, was breaking under the weight of this family betrayal. The case was eventually dismissed on a technicality that felt like a punch to the gut. A procedural error my attorneys had made in the initial filing gave the judge grounds to throw out our primary charges without fully examining the evidence. We could appeal, could refile with corrections, could continue fighting, but the message was painfully clear. This was going to be a long, expensive fight with no guarantees of justice at the end. My sister's lawyers had successfully created enough legal complexity and reasonable doubt that criminal charges became unlikely to succeed. The forged signature, despite expert testimony, was disputed through competing analysis and questions about methodology and standards of proof. My sister didn't go to jail. She didn't face criminal prosecution. She agreed to relinquish any claim to the property, to repay a portion of the money she had taken, though far less than what was actually owed and with a payment plan that would take years to complete. In exchange, We dropped the civil suit and agreed not to pursue further criminal complaints. It felt like losing. It felt like watching someone hurt the person you love most in the world and then walk away with barely a consequence. My lawyers told me this was actually a reasonable outcome given the complexities of the case, that further litigation would cost substantially more money and take significantly more time and emotional energy, with no guarantee of a better result. They were probably right from a purely practical standpoint. That didn't make it any easier to accept or any less infuriating. I moved my mother out of the mansion as soon as the legal situation stabilized. The house that was supposed to represent safety and success and recognition of a life well lived had become a source of trauma. She couldn't live there anymore, couldn't walk through those rooms without remembering the parties and the uniforms and the faces of people who had used her. We found a smaller place, still comfortable and secure but more intimate, more manageable, the kind of space where you could actually feel at home instead of feeling lost. It was a beautiful condo in San Diego, close to the water, but without the overwhelming scale and exposure of the mansion, with a community of other residents who were friendly without being intrusive. I stayed with her for 8 months, using accumulated leave, and then transitioning out of the military entirely. 13 years was enough. I had given enough to abstract missions and distant causes, and proving I could do what people said I couldn't. It was time to be present for the one mission that actually mattered more than anything else. During those months, I watched my mother slowly come back to herself, but she was fundamentally changed, more cautious, more guarded, less trusting. The easy warmth she once had was gone, replaced by wariness and hesitation. She second-guessed her own decisions constantly, asked for confirmation on things she would have once handled confidently without thinking, doubted her own judgment in ways that broke my heart. The dignity and self-assurance that had defined her had been systematically stripped away, and I wasn't sure if it would ever fully return, or if this diminished version was now permanent. We didn't talk much about my sister once the initial crisis passed. She had tried to reach out several times, messages that mixed vague apologies with self-justification, that tried to rewrite what happened into something more forgivable and understandable. My mother read them and deleted them without responding, and I didn't push her in either direction. That was her relationship to define or end, her decision to make, without pressure from me. I had my own anger to manage, my own sense of betrayal to process. The sister I thought I knew, the person I had trusted to protect what mattered most, had never really existed. The guilt was the hardest part to carry, the knowledge that my absence had created the conditions for this exploitation, that the very sacrifices I made to protect and provide for my mother had ultimately made her vulnerable. I replayed decisions constantly in my mind, wondering what I should have done differently, what I could have done better. Should I have stayed home instead of joining the military? Should I have visited more frequently during my service? Should I have installed more oversight and verification systems beyond just financial transfers? Should I have not trusted my sister so completely? The answers weren't simple, because the truth is that trust always creates vulnerability, family always involves risk, and love inherently means giving people the power to hurt you deeply. I had trusted because that's what family is supposed to mean, because I wanted to believe the values my mother had taught us had shaped both her daughters equally. I was wrong about one of us, and that realization changed everything. Looking back now with more distance, I can see warning signs I missed or rationalized away because I wanted to believe my sister was who I thought she was. She had always been charming but never quite as responsible as she claimed, always had plans that sounded impressive but rarely delivered the results she promised, always had explanations for why opportunities didn't work out that placed blame everywhere except on her own choices. But I had been too far away, too focused on my own demanding career, too willing to believe that distance and money could substitute for actual presence and oversight. I thought I was being a good daughter by providing financial security, by buying a house that would keep my mother safe and comfortable for the rest of her life. What I didn't understand until it was too late is that the house was just an object, just a collection of walls and systems that could be weaponized and exploited. What my mother actually needed wasn't a mansion or financial transfers or elaborate security systems. She needed someone who was there, someone who could see what was happening in real time and intervene before the damage became systematic and deeply rooted. The question that haunts me still is whether I would have seen the warning signs if I had been present more often, if I had been home instead of deployed to places I can't discuss. Would I have noticed my sister's true character earlier? Would I have caught the exploitation before it became normalized? Or would I have been too close, too invested in family loyalty and wanting everyone to get along, too willing to make excuses and rationalize concerning behavior? I honestly don't know the answer, and that uncertainty is its own form of torture. What I do know is that the people closest to us have the greatest power to cause harm, that betrayal from a stranger is painful, but betrayal from family is devastating in ways that don't fully heal, that the line between protection and control is much thinner than we want to believe. I had tried to protect my mother from external threats, from poverty and insecurity and the chaos of an unpredictable world, but I hadn't protected her from the one threat I never imagined, my own sister using family bonds as cover for systematic exploitation. They didn't steal money first. They stole her dignity. That's what people who haven't experienced elder financial exploitation don't fully understand. The money is certainly part of it. The financial harm is real and significant. But the deeper crime is the erosion of self-worth, the systematic destruction of a person's belief in their own judgment and value and autonomy. My mother had been reduced to serving drinks in her own house, wearing a uniform, being invisible to people who were guests in what should have been her personal sanctuary. That psychological violence, that calculated degradation, was worse than any amount of stolen money, and it was much harder to repair or recover from. Now, nearly 2 years later, we've found a kind of stability, though it feels fragile and hard-won rather than natural and secure. My mother has good days and difficult days. On good days, she laughs at old memories, makes plans for small trips we might take, talks about maybe taking art classes or joining a book club or finding ways to connect with other people her age. On difficult days, she's quiet and distant, lost in thoughts she doesn't always share, unable to shake the feeling that she should have known better, should have protected herself, should have been stronger and more aware. I tell her constantly that none of this was her fault, that she trusted her daughter because that's what mothers do, that the failure was my sister's and mine, not hers. Some days she believes me, other days she doesn't, and I have to accept that some damage doesn't fully heal, that some betrayals leave permanent scars. I sold the mansion eventually. Couldn't keep it, couldn't even look at photographs of it without feeling rage and regret mixing together in ways that made it hard to breathe. The market was strong despite everything happening in the world, and I got a good price, enough to ensure my mother's financial security for the rest of her life regardless of what happens, enough to fund whatever care she needs and whatever life she wants to build. The money from the sale sits in new accounts with multiple layers of oversight and protection, with systems specifically designed to prevent exactly what happened before from ever happening again. I handle everything now. Make every financial decision, review every document, sign everything myself. My mother is relieved to have that burden lifted, grateful to not have to worry about managing complex financial matters. But sometimes I wonder if I'm making a different version of the same mistake, if protecting her too much is just another form of taking away her autonomy and agency. It's a balance I'm still learning to navigate, the line between appropriate support and excessive control. My sister and I don't speak and likely never will. There's nothing left to say, no bridge that can be rebuilt across the wreckage of what she did. I heard through distant cousins that she moved to Arizona, that she's working in corporate event planning now, that she tells people her family turned on her over a business disagreement and misunderstanding. I don't bother correcting that narrative when it filters back to me. People who want to believe her version will believe it regardless of evidence, and the people whose opinions I actually care about know the truth. What haunts me most beyond the personal betrayal is how easily it happened, how many people knew or suspected something was wrong and said nothing, how the systems that should protect vulnerable people failed so completely and predictably. My mother wasn't some isolated victim with no family and no resources. She had a daughter who was sending money consistently, who called regularly despite difficult circumstances, who cared deeply about her welfare and security. She had neighbors and a community and theoretical access to legal protections. And still, it took me physically being there, unexpectedly walking through that door, to discover what was happening right in front of everyone. How many other people are going through similar situations right now, being exploited by family members who use power of attorney and physical proximity and blood relationships as cover to strip away dignity and autonomy? How many adult children are deployed overseas or working demanding jobs or just living their own busy lives, too far away to notice the warning signs until it's too late? How many people are making the same mistakes I made, thinking that money and legal documents and good intentions are enough protection, not understanding that real safeguarding requires consistent presence and attention? I don't have satisfying answers to those questions, but they keep me awake at night, make me wonder how many versions of my story are playing out silently across the country right now. This experience fundamentally changed how I see family, how I understand loyalty, how I think about the promises we make to protect each other. It taught me that love without verification is dangerous naivety, that trust without accountability creates opportunities for exploitation, that good intentions and financial support can't substitute for actual vigilant presence. It taught me that the people who share your blood aren't automatically the people who share your values or deserve your trust, that betrayal is most devastating when it comes from someone who is supposed to be safe, who you never thought you needed to protect yourself against. It taught me that coming home from war zones doesn't mean the fighting is over, that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones fought in living rooms and courtrooms, with lawyers instead of weapons, with financial documents instead of tactical plans. It taught me that being a woman in my field meant I had already learned to fight for every inch of respect and recognition, but that those same skills didn't protect the person I loved most from a different kind of predator who wore the face of family. Would you have seen the warning signs? That's the question that haunts me most, the one I turn over in my mind during quiet hours when I can't sleep. Would you have noticed your parent being diminished and exploited, systematically stripped of dignity and autonomy? Would you have caught it early, or would you have trusted like I did, believed that family meant automatic safety and protection? I want to believe people would do better, would be more vigilant, more present, more willing to ask hard, uncomfortable questions. But I've learned that belief is cheap and verification is hard, that we naturally see what we expect and want to see until reality forces us to look closer and question our assumptions. I left to protect strangers, people I would never meet, in countries I couldn't name, fighting for abstract concepts like freedom and security that felt noble and important. And while I was gone, doing work that mattered in ways I believed justified the sacrifice, the one person who mattered most to me, the person I was really trying to honor and protect with all that sacrifice, was being victimized in ways I couldn't have imagined by someone I should have seen coming. The irony is almost unbearable, the kind of cosmic joke that would be funny if it wasn't so devastating and permanent. If you think this story was shocking, wait until you hear what happened next, because this isn't really just about one family's betrayal and exploitation. It's about the systems that allow this kind of abuse to flourish, the cultural assumptions that enable it to continue unchecked, the ways we collectively fail to protect the people who need protection most urgently. It's about what happens when trust becomes a weapon that can be turned against you, when family relationships become threats instead of safety, when the institutions and legal systems designed to help prove inadequate or indifferent or too slow to prevent lasting damage. What would you have done differently? That's not a rhetorical question meant to make you think abstractly. I genuinely want to know, need to understand, because despite everything I learned through 13 years of military service, all the training and experience and hard-won survival skills and tactical knowledge, I still don't know with certainty if I would make fundamentally different choices, if I could somehow go back and start over. Would I have stayed home instead of enlisting and pursuing the career that defined me? Would I have visited more frequently despite the operational demands and security restrictions? Would I have trusted less and verified more aggressively from the beginning? Or would I have made essentially the same decisions because at the time, with the information and perspective I had, they seemed not just reasonable but right and necessary? Comment below. I read every single one, and I mean that genuinely. Tell me if you've seen this pattern happen in your own family or community, if you've worried about aging parents or vulnerable family members, if you've struggled with the impossible balance between trust and vigilance, between respecting autonomy and providing protection. Tell me what you would have done differently in my situation, what systems or safeguards worked for you, what warning signs you learned to recognize before they became crises. This isn't just my story that I'm sharing with you. It's a warning, a hard lesson, a call to pay closer attention before it becomes too late to intervene effectively. Subscribe for stories they never wanted you to hear, for the uncomfortable truths about family dynamics and trust, and the real price of absence, for investigations into how the people closest to us can sometimes be the most dangerous precisely because we don't see them coming. Because this wasn't an isolated incident that happened to one unlucky family. This pattern is happening every single day in every community across this country, to families who thought they were safe and protected, who believed that love and blood relationships meant automatic loyalty and protection.